Laura Chandler, and my guest today is activist, mindfulness teacher, and president of the Mind and Life Institute, Susan Bauer-Wu. And she is also the author of the new book, A Future We Can Love. Welcome, Susan.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for having me. It's really my pleasure to be here with you.
I'm so happy you're here. And we're talking about your book. It's just been published. It's a great book. And it was inspired by the conversation between Greta Thunberg and His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, on the climate crisis. And as I said, it's a great read, full of lots of information, helpful points of action. And most of all, it's hopeful, and not in a Pollyanna way. It's genuinely hopeful. And I know it's based on this conversation, this important conversation, but what would you say it was in you that wanted to write this book?
Yeah. Well, the book absolutely was inspired by the conversation with His Holiness and Greta and climate scientists. It took place in January 2021. It took place 3 days after the insurrection in Washington, D.C. And we had nearly 1 million people that joined us live for that event. I live on the East Coast in Virginia. It was about 11 p.m. here. It was early morning in India, in the middle of the night in Sweden, where Greta was. And it's kind of extraordinary that that many people showed up and were interested in the topic. I think it's, of course, the topic is totally timely. This is the topic we all need to be talking about. And I believe that the Dalai Lama and Greta are just beacons of wisdom and inspiration and hope for all of us. And so after the event, we were actually approached by a book publisher who wanted to publish mostly the transcripts from the event, which was only, it was about an hour and a half event, so it wasn't a lot. And we did publish that in Europe, in German. And then we decided, my book agent, Stephanie Tade, who I know you know, we just basically came together to think there's a fuller story that needs to be told here. And that's what the book is about. It was inspired by a conversation. It's written like a conversation with lots of wise, brilliant, beautiful people who are included in that conversation. And we hope that you all continue the conversation after. And for me, I came to it really as the leader of Mind and Life. It's officially a Mind and Life book, and all the proceeds go to the Mind and Life Institute. But I have to tell you, when I started working on the book, and it took about a solid year of writing, and I did work with a co-writer, Stephanie Higgs, and we just were steady at it for a good year, doing research and talking to people. I just got transformed as a result of working on it. And I used to be, I think like a lot of people, just kind of like feeling this overwhelming dread about what is happening with climate change, and just feeling like I didn't know enough, or I was just immobilized thinking that there was nothing I could do. So I just kind of, closed down into my cocoon. And what I found through that transformation of working on the book is like there's a lot of amazing people all over the world doing great things. And what I learned about the science of climate feedback loops, I realized that actually there's more that we can do, and that I'm not alone. And the more I've talked about it, the better I've been feeling. So that kind of was the background of getting the book started.
That's great. And I love to hear that you're transformed by the book, because I think that is how I would sell it myself to our listeners. I would say it contains so much information, and that's kind of dovetails into my next question, which is, what you were talking about, there's so much information out there that it can feel overwhelming. And I think you described how so many people feel like, I know it's happening, it's so big, and I don't know what to do.
Mhm.
And what would you say to those people? Read the book is what I would say.
Yeah. Yes, I think you'll get a lot more from reading the book. But the first thing I will say is the first thing you need to do is to not run away from it and to really open up, be awake to the realities of where the truth of what is happening, and to see that there's a lot of good and possibility that's happening along with, the hard realities that things absolutely are changing and changing pretty quickly. The other thing is by talking about it. So you ask, what can you do? I think by talking about it, you will feel better by realizing that you're part of this web, this amazing interconnected web of all beings all over the entire planet. And, once we begin to sort of realize that we're part of it, that we are part of the problem and we're also part of the solution. And then the really like simple, pithy thing, like when people say, what can I do? And I'd say this is that first is to wake up, be mindful. And what are you mindful of? You're mindful of all these little micro decisions that you make on an everyday basis. So there are 5 things that I think that many of us do, if not all of us. So be mindful when we eat. Think about climate. So mindful and think about climate in what we eat. We know that vegetarian, plant-based diets are good for our bodies and they're good for climate. Think about climate when you're shopping. And it's the products that you're using, but also in essence, buying local is also really good. You're cutting down on fossil fuel use. So eating, shopping, traveling. Think about climate when you're traveling. When you're ready, when you really want to take a vacation, do you really have to go to an exotic vacation all the way across the world? Is that necessary? Just ask yourself, like, without blaming or shaming, like just being really thoughtful, asking yourself that. Traveling, meaning also when you're buying a vehicle, do you need, a big vehicle that uses a lot of fossil fuels or not? Can you buy a hybrid or an electric car? If you live in the city, do you even need a vehicle? Can you just use public transportation? So traveling. Next is voting. And you ask climate scientists, like, what can we do? Because I asked a lot of climate scientists. Every one of them says the most important thing we can do as citizens is to vote. That actually voting for leaders who are very conscious and deliberate about making wise decisions for the climate is really one of the most powerful things we could do. Don't underestimate the power of our votes. And that goes for local voting in your community and your state, as well as nationally. And then finally, if you're fortunate enough and privileged enough to have money to invest, consider climate in the investments that you make. So those five
Those
things.
excellent points and points of action that people can really do right now.
Yeah.
And, speaking of information, one of the things that I think your book does very well is it gathers so much information and explains what's happening with the climate now so that we can understand it. And, I think what I liked about it is it's all in one place, and it's a variety of information that's so clearly put together. So can we start with a little climate education. Can the book starts with feedback loops and tipping points, and I think that's helpful to know about.
Yeah, yeah. So climate feedback loops is actually the science really that actually was included in the event with the Dalai Lama and Greta.
Mhm.
So I was not aware of climate feedback loops actually until we were preparing for this event. And one of our Mind and Life board members, his name is Barry Hershey, he's a filmmaker. And when he heard about climate feedback loops, he's like, well, more people need to know about this. And so he created these films that were launched at the same time as the event with the Dalai Lama and Greta that I mentioned. They're called Climate Emergency Feedback Loops. And maybe you could include this in your notes, Laura, when you post it. But it's there's a website freely available in 27 languages, and they have 5 short films. They're only about 15 minutes each, and they also, as a visual, show you about climate feedback loops. And in my book, I kind of interpreted those and extrapolated those into, more of a written description understanding. But why climate feedback loops are important and to understand is that global warming in and of itself is actually creating more warming, and that is accelerating the warming. And there are several climate feedback loops. And I'll just share with you a few of them, and then I'll unpack and talk about one in a little bit more. But one, I think in the book, I call it the melting mirror feedback loop. And that's the albedo feedback loop, which is basically because of global warming, the glaciers in the Arctic are melting. They're melting rapidly. Like in the summertime, there's like no glaciers. They actually completely melt all summer. That didn't used to be the case. And what happened, and then they start to freeze over, but they're freezing over less and less. So when we have glaciers, what do? They reflect back the light and sort of deflect the warming. But what happens when they start to melt is they become dark water, and they absorb the water. They absorb the heat. And when they absorb the heat, then that contributes to more warming. So the warming itself is accelerating warming. There's another feedback loop that relates to the permafrost, which is also, that's the very, very, very thick frozen land, again, up in the Arctic area. And this is land that's been frozen for thousands of years, and it's plants, decomposed plants and bones and animals are decomposed in there, frozen for thousands of years. But what's happening, they are melting, thawing at an unprecedented rate. I've talked to climate scientists who said they go up there now in the summertime and they fall through the ground. There's no ground, they're falling through. And what that's happening, that's thousands of years of carbon and methane stored that are being released as a result of the thawing. And when that's released, what happens? That contributes and accelerates the warming. So, and then the one that I love to talk about, and I just briefly mention it, relates to trees. And so the disappearing trees in forests, which are dying, they're dying because of drought and fires. They're also dying because of diseases and insects. And what happens is you have old growth forests, old growth trees, big, big trees. Trees are natural carbon absorbers. I do this because it's like with their leaves and with their branches, they're sucking in the carbon from the atmosphere, and they're storing it in their trunks. They're just naturally cooling the planet just by being who they are. But what happens when they die? because of drought and bugs and diseases, or because of man-made clear cutting. When those big trees die or are killed, what happens? They cut down, and all of the carbon that they've been storing all those years is released back. And then that contributes to the warming. So it's the warming that's warming itself, and it accelerates the warming. That's the bad news. And the other bad news is that there will be a point when we reach a tipping point, which means that it will be very, very hard to slow down and to cool the planet in ways that will be really necessary to minimize the loss of life.
Mhm.
Good news though, feedback loops, if we can slow it down, we could and actually halt them, we can begin to let the natural cooling of the earth do what it's meant to do. And that can happen actually pretty quickly once we get it going in the right direction. We're not going there yet, but it can, it's possible. And the other good news is we haven't crossed the tipping point yet, according to the scientists that I've spoken to.
And I want to talk about that good news. I want to stay here just a little bit longer, because understanding the loop is a big deal. And I was surprised myself at some of the statistics. Like, I think with the melting mirror loop, it was, and this is roughly from my memory, 85% of the sun's rays have been reflected by the protecting us, like
yeah.
And now something like 90% of the sun's rays are absorbed, because the ocean is that great absorber, as you said. And that is stunning. That is stunning. And yet, if we can slow or stop or reverse and start, having the Arctic return to some degree, we can stop that loop. And I think there was the blanket cloud loop too, which works similar. It's like, it's amazing, because it's like, okay, the clouds are reflecting until they're not reflecting. And then vapor is trapping the heat.
Very good. You got it. Exactly.
I was like, okay, because I understood some of it, but you really make it accessible. And it's, and again, with the example you gave of the disappearing tree loop, of course, we know, that, well, not of course, but, we did learn, in school that trees absorb, carbon, and that they clean the air for us. They're our lungs. Okay. But this idea that there's a tipping point, and this is one of the tipping points, when the forests degrade so much that they will begin to produce more carbon into the atmosphere than they take out. And that's from the decay, that's from they hold carbon, as well as, because they're holding carbon. So they won't be able to even clean their own carbon.
Very, very well said, Laura.
Well, thanks to you, because it's really put very clearly. And so I say again, to anyone who's listening that's been trying to grapple with this, and kind of feels alone in it, and I get to interconnectedness too, because I think there are a lot of people that are feeling, I don't know if isolated is the word, but just, amongst friends and family, people don't have the same level of awareness, and they don't know where to go or what to do. And so your book really offers that. So and one of the things that you talk about, you talk about, I want to get to this, Vandana Shiva. That was there are some great stories here. So not only is the does His Holiness and Greta figure prominently throughout the book and their thoughts and some really, cogent things that they have to say. But you've brought in many, many, many scientists, thought leaders, spiritual teachers like Joanna Macy, indigenous wisdom holders, who have studied this and who have helpful things to say and to share. And we'll start with Vandana Shiva's point and your point. And I've been thinking this myself for a long time. We have separated ourselves from the earth. This culture, this contemporary culture that we live in, no longer thinks of itself as part of the earth and has treated the earth as something to, we use the term exploit, but to use, and that is there to serve us, when in fact, we are here to work together with the earth. So I don't know if you'd like to say some more about that.
Yeah, we have, as Vandana Shiva, says, we've not only exploited her, we've just extract her as if she is there to serve her and we are her master. And that breaks my heart to think about that. We are the earth, right? We cannot survive without air and oxygen that comes from trees and plants. We are 80+% water. So water is a natural element. And water, there's a lot of places around the world where you can't get safe drinking water. And then the food we eat, the food comes from the earth and we can't survive without it. We are the earth. And to think that we just can extract as if it's limitless is really, really ignorant, because it is limited. She is limited. And once too much damage is done, then we can't go back. In the book, maybe you're going to ask this, but it seems like a natural point where it relates, is I talk about human feedback loops. So I talk about climate feedback loops and then talk about human feedback loops. And I think this kind of relates to one of the feedback loops. So I don't know if I should mention that or not. Please. I don't want to get too far ahead.
No, this is great.
Okay. So there's so if any of you are familiar with Buddhism, you're familiar with the three poisons. And so I see those three poisons as being human feedback loops that contribute to the climate crisis. So they're essentially greed, aversion, and delusion, right? Greed, hatred, and delusion, or greed, aversion, and delusion. So greed is really the first one that I think contribute, what you were quoting Vandana Shiva, and us just having this very extractive mentality, is essentially we want more, 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 more. It's like it's endless. And we also, instead of feeling fulfilled and satisfied and interconnected, our perception that we are separate has us yearning for more externally, thinking that that's going to make us happy. That's going to make us fulfilled. And so we are constantly having this growth mentality of wanting more, 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 doing more, more, more. Yeah. And what happens? Are we really happier? the statistics speak for itself that, the wealthiest countries in the world and the wealthiest people in the world, once you reach a certain amount of income, which there is, there's a certain amount that we do need to, you know, to have just our basic needs being met. But once we reach that level beyond that, it really doesn't contribute to more happiness or, better health necessarily. And so the greed mentality, so it relates to the climate crisis, is that we just feel like we don't have enough, and we can't be satisfied or satiated.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
That's a really important point. And it's almost like there's a fear feedback loop that gets tied into that, where, we're afraid that, greed is sort of fueled by that idea that we're afraid we won't have enough. And, there's a lot of external information telling us that,
Exactly. We are getting these messages that tell us, oh yeah, yeah, all the marketing and social media and all these messages that are, yeah,
and it becomes kind of like eating potato chips, it's like a few and you're kind of good, but then it's just that at a certain point, it's like you don't stop, even though you could stop.
yeah.
I think I remember a study where the satisfaction, measuring the level of satisfaction of like a purchasing something that you're really excited about, a car, or, that new coat or whatever it is, but it lasts maybe 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so then you need the next potato chip,
Yeah.
and so that's where your point about mindfulness becomes so important. It's like, let's just interrupt that feedback loop for a moment and see where we are. And you talk more about this in the book, and this is one of the hopeful points. And there's a lot of hope in the book. There's so much potential.
We go through a whole narrative. We start with the problems.
Yeah.
And this part of the book, I think it's framed as the problem with business as usual.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so where was I going with that one? Oh, we'll come back.
I'm sorry.
No, not at all. Please, not at all. Well, it'll come back around, but where it's basically the point I would like to come back to, and we'll come back into this hopefulness, is where we were talking about our interconnectedness, and how, okay, when we recognizing our interconnectedness, and this is also part of a mindfulness, just sort of waking up to ourselves, as you pointed, is that with the recognizing that we're interconnected is going to help us make the changes that we need to change, and also feel the support that we have that's available to us. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about interconnectedness and how it helps.
Yeah, well, I can speak personally about this, in that, and this is myself, but also from my web of connections of people that I relate to, is that when we feel separate, when we think we are separate, it's very isolating. And it's lonely. And we have an epidemic of loneliness in this country. The Surgeon General has said that it is like one of the biggest public health problems it is the biggest public health problem of our time right now, is this epidemic of loneliness. We just, and it's like ironic, because we're so hyper connected in one way, yet we feel so isolated. And I know that when we begin to wake up and to realize that we are part of the trees and the natural world, we inter-are, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, right? We are interbreathing with the trees. They can't survive without us. We can't survive without them. We are inter-are. And the moment we begin to like really feel into that and to really be aware of how we are part of this web with other human beings as well, we begin, I think it's like we begin to, you know, to wake up, and, you know, love begins to permeate, and then that makes us, you know, feel better. And then the better we feel, the more awake we are. And then that becomes a positive feedback loop unto itself.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about, there's a story in the book about Chaco Canyon, which is with is Lila June. And I'll preface it by saying, another thing you say in the book is, you know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, we already have, you know, examples of how to do this from indigenous cultures, for example. But Lila June talks about the this the ancient Puebloans of Chaco Canyon and the drought that came, and about how it was a gift. And so if you can talk a little about that.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've read that, but I'll try my best to remember it. And it was I think it's a Dine, which is Navajo. I think that's, yeah, I think that's what she's Dine.
She's Cheyenne and Dine, yeah.
Yeah.
Ancient Puebloans is kind of the general
The general
for the older, that older culture that disappeared.
Right.
But then they
Yeah.
actually they dispersed and became multiple cultures that we're familiar with now, Zuni and Puebloans and so on. Sorry, but
yeah,
she talks about how it was a mystery, you know, what happened. And she said, it wasn't a mystery to our people. We know what happened, right? That came out of balance. We acted like gods, the priests.
Yes.
Disparity between the hierarchy, you know, there was a hierarchy and disparity between the power and people without power, and we misused the water. And
and then they woke up, and they began to wake up, and they used it as a lesson. And that's why it is no surprise that we're where we are. And yes, Lila June shines the light on the hope, like, of that lesson. We can bring that to our times today.
Yeah, that it's a gift, that we're being shown what we can do.
Yeah.
I loved that.
Yeah.
There's one more story, another story that stood out for me. I call it the story about the meter in the living room or in the hallway. Right? It's like when people are questioning, well, what can I do? Like, it's so hard to manage my energy. But like, if you're aware of it, we're back to this idea of knowledge. If you're aware of how much you're using, you'll be more mindful about it.
Yeah.
You don't have to take something away from yourself, you know, in some painful way. It's like you just start to notice it and go.
Yeah, so once you start to notice, that's that story. Yeah, it was a study that they did, and they had a meter of electricity usage, and it was a place where they walked by in the house all the time, and then another place it was down in the basement. And just having it in a place where they could see it impacted how much they actually used.
And it wasn't even meant as a study necessarily. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it was like they noticed that. Am I correct in that? Like they sort of noticed that the people who had it where they could see it were using energy.
And they observed that was happening. They observed that was happening. Yeah.
A spontaneous study.
Yeah.
It's really fast.
And those are little things, like things like that, though. That's why we lifted it up in the book. Is that those are low, like, they can be low-hanging fruits that we can begin to, try to have that be available to, to all of us.
Yeah. Well, it is so big a subject. I mean, it is so big. Like, I get why people are like, I don't know what to do. And so I appreciate that low hanging fruit, because you can, have that one, and then you can have the next one and the next one.
Yeah.
And which leads me to the global bio plan of planting. If everyone, this is fascinating to me, if everyone planted 6 trees, we would reverse climate change.
Yes. Yeah, so Diana Beresford Kroger, who's a biologist based in Canada, that's what she suggested. If we all did that. We're talking about 8 billion people, so some of us have to plant more.
Yes.
And yeah, but the other thing related to that, though, is I just want to underscore is that planting 6 small trees does not replace clearing one big old tree. They're not one for one.
No,
Okay,
no.
so we have to do both. We have to plant the trees and to really, and that will just help to cool the planet, and then we can stop the old trees from dying. And there are amazing innovations that are happening.
Yeah.
One thing I heard recently, there's a new type of sand that's pulls carbon out of the atmosphere, and they're starting to put it on beaches.
Oh, that's
Pretty
amazing.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are a lot of innovations that are happening, and those innovations have to continue to happen. And at the same time, what can we do in the meantime? And there's a lot that we can do.
Yeah. And I want to emphasize, I think that's really true. Protecting the old trees is imperative. I live in a neighborhood which is a little bit unusual in San Francisco, because it is a neighborhood and there are yards, and there's like, some of them are wraparound, and it's named for the Monterey pine, because there's a number of very old 100-year-old trees throughout the neighborhood. And my arborist grew up here, and he knows every tree, and they're in the book, in the book about San Francisco and whatnot. And people cut them down. I mean, and my partner, you can't cut that tree down, and thankfully, and there are many people who do preserve the trees, but people lose track of, that you would cut this amazing ecosystem down. I go for a walk, and under the tree, it's raining, because it's doing what it does. It's providing us with, it's cooling the planet, among other things, but it's also providing home we have red-tailed hawk and owls, and the whole ecosystem that's still trying to live within cities, because they've lost their habitat. So that was the other thing that Diana Beresford Kroger was saying, is that, protect your neighborhoods and make your neighborhoods recognize the biosystem, the ecosystem that's within that,
Yeah. Yeah. It comes back to waking up again. Yeah. And also, connecting with the name of your show and this program of Sacred Stream. Our natural world is sacred. And Vandana Shiva talks about this a lot, is that the separation we see with them is, we basically have this eye that they're just, these objective things. But if we can begin to change our relationship with the natural world to truly see it for what it is, which is sacred, then we will care for her, instead of saying it, right? Care for them. We begin to change our relationship with them,
Mhm.
then our actions will follow.
Yeah. And you've been uh, following this topic for a long time. And how do you think we're doing? Are we changing? Are our hearts and minds shifting?
I think a lot more people are shifting
Mhm.
than in just the last couple of years because of what we are witnessing,
Mhm.
what we are experiencing. Living on the West Coast, the fires that you've experienced and the smoke that you've experienced for really the last few years. Now the East Coast is starting to experience it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The the 2 days before our book launch event in New York City, the sky over New York City was red. It was the worst air quality in the history of New York City.
Wow. Yeah.
And now there are floods in New England that we've never had before. There's extreme weather patterns, which actually relates to the jet stream, and that's another feedback loop that I describe. And so I do think, and I think that the news is actually shining a light on it even more. There are activists. There's a lot of young activists, which give me a lot of hope. Young activists and scientists and business leaders, young people who
Yeah.
are like really, really extraordinary, that are making significant changes.
Yeah.
And people of my generation, I'd say, are starting to wake up in new ways.
Yeah.
And so that does give me hope. I do think it's changing. And at the same time, I don't think it's everybody. There's
Yeah.
still conspiracy theories that climate change isn't happening, which is just sad.
Mhm.
Um, and the other, I talk about this in the book, and it relates to one of one of the human feedback loops, is that we like our comforts.
Mhm.
We like our lives as they are in general, and we don't want to think that we need to change anything.
Mhm.
And that we think if we have to change, we have to give something up. And what I encourage people to think about is that instead of thinking of what you have to give up, think about all you have to gain.
Yeah. That's a good
And
point.
actually, and we learned a little bit of this during COVID, is that by simplifying our lives, we actually can be more connected with one another and with nature and with what actually truly gives us meaning. And so there's a lot that we can gain um, by rather than give up. Yes, we'll have to give some things up, but we have a lot to gain as well.
And it's just the extra potato chips that you're giving up that weren't really doing it for you anyway.
Exactly. I love that. Yes.
Well, I agree, and I think that I do see more and more young people um, less engaged in that drive towards accumulation. I mean, it's still part of our culture, but it is there are more there's more interest in preserving nature and being in nature and being conscious of these things, of our interconnectedness. And so that does give me hope too.
Mhm.
You say in the book, there's a great section, which are the to-do lists of all of
Mhm.
these great scientists and thinkers and spiritual teachers. And is there anything from there that stands out for you that you'd like to share?
Well, the first thing is there's not just one magic to-do list. There are a lot of entry points and there's a lot of paths that you can take. So there is a lot that you can do. And it's not one size fits all for everybody. And as Paul Hawkins says, is that most important list is the one that the one you want, can, and will do. So the book offers a lot of possibilities, and I encourage people to just be curious and to think, well, take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and put it together in a way that makes sense to you, and where you aren't overwhelmed. A lot of times we think about just simple behavior change programs like exercise programs, and we create like this perfect workout program that's impossible for anybody to do. Like and the moment you look at it, you think you have to do it. It's so overwhelming that you stop doing anything and everything. And so the most important thing is to like just be really honest with yourself. Sit down, talk with your friends, have dinner, or get together with some friends and just talk about it. We actually do have a reader's discussion guide for the book, that may help you to sit down and have like a little book group and a discussion group, and at the end of it, just think about, well, what can I do? I'm actually doing it in my community here in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm getting together monthly with people in the community, and we're going through each section of the book, and at the end, and it includes quiet time together, sharing, unpacking some of the book, doing some of the contemplative practices, and basically, coming up with your own, eco plan that resonates with you.
That's great. That's great. The book is A Future We Can Love. It's a fantastic book. It's in multiple languages. Will probably be in even more, but European languages, German, Italian, and so on. You can get it everywhere you get your books. Buy locally, and they'll order it for you.
And there are ebooks and also audiobooks. If you also, even though we did print it in a very as eco-conscious way as possible. Shambhala Publications has been wonderful to work with, and so it's printed sustainably. But if you really also don't want that, it's available in ebooks as well as audio.
Fantastic. Susan, it has been my pleasure. Thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for writing this book.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, for your genuine interest in this and for having me.